I actually started in a completely unrelated field. Before I got into doing research on depression, I was actually looking at neural injury. And so, in fact, the focus that I had for many years was on child restraint injuries. And that was a focus for, I think, five years, looking at ways that we could improve child restraint usage. And I found that it was really rewarding, it was great, but because I do have family that have depression, that was always tugging away at me, sort of at the back of my mind. And I found out that Black Dog was doing a lot of really interesting research, specifically led by Professor Colleen Loo, looking at new methods of treatment for depression, so methods that go beyond kind of standard pharmacotherapy, trying to broaden the arsenal available to psychiatrists to treat depression. And I actually initially started as a volunteer. So I kept on doing my job, looking at child restraint injuries, and actually came over here 1 or 2 days a week just to help out with some other research that people were doing, and enjoyed it so much and was so interested by it that I stuck around. And so at the beginning, what we did is we looked at what's called non-invasive brain stimulation. So that's brain stimulation that doesn't require any form of surgical implantation. We're just stimulating essentially from the outside of the head. We're never digging in, we're never going below the skin, and looking at whether that can act as a new treatment for depression. And since then, it's broadened. So now we do non-invasive brain stimulation. We also do ketamine as a new treatment for depression. We research electroconvulsive therapy, and we're now expanding as well into psychedelics. And we're always open to sort of even newer forms of treatment as they kind of come onto the scene. Yes, when we talk about novel treatments, I mean, the old treatments, they're not really old, but pharmacotherapy is considered the sort of the standard. Pharmacotherapy has been around for many, many decades, and it's been quite a few years since we've seen any substantial revolutions in standard pharmacotherapy. So SSRIs, SNRIs, those kinds of things. Then we have a kind of new wave that started in the 2000s, which I guess some people now call electroceuticals instead of pharmaceuticals. And so the electroceuticals are the brain stimulation types of treatments. So they're also considered novel. And in fact, one of them, transcranial magnetic stimulation, has just recently, in the last couple of years, received approval from Medicare to be rebatable. So people can now receive money back when they get treatment using this form of brain stimulation. And even newer than that, you have sort of what I guess were recreational drugs and still are, but in a clinical context, in much lower doses and much more carefully controlled doses. We have ketamine, which is an old drug. It was invented in the late 30s, I believe, and has incredible effects in terms of neuroplasticity. So it forces the brain to create new connections. And we think those new connections are part of the reason why it has a very potent antidepressant effect. So potent that people can go from being profoundly unwell and depressed to normal within a couple of days, 2-3 days. And then the even more recent one is psychedelics. I mean, psychedelics have a long history. They were first synthesized in the previous century, but they fell out of favor from, let's say, the late 70s, early 80s, largely because of the war on drugs, which I think originated in the United States. Thankfully, in the last decade, they've seen a huge resurgence led by research, I believe, from the UK. And now we're finding that psychedelics combined with psychotherapy, so it's called psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, has also got this very high potential for treating depression, largely for the same reasons as ketamine. We think that it helps the brain fall into a more plastic state, a more easily changeable state. And once the brain is in this plastic state, if you couple that with psychotherapy, you can guide the brain into a new pattern of thinking that escapes the ruts and the stagnant thinking that is a symptom of depression. So at the moment, ketamine is not given in combination with psychotherapy, although that's a very obvious strategy, potentially, to improve the effects. And so that is something that a few people are looking at now. So trying to couple psychotherapy with ketamine to see if we can boost the efficacy even further. With psychedelics, potentially because, as you've said, in the past, psychedelics are often coupled with this spiritual component. So they're naturally already tied to a form of psychotherapy. It's not formal psychotherapy. It would be more of a spiritual guided, joint experience. But because there is that history of having a guide lead you through the experience, that might have prompted this idea of immediately linking psychedelics with a guide who's trained in formal psychotherapy. And so the psychotherapists, at the moment, they go through rigorous training. It's not training that I've done personally, but it is training that allows people to anticipate the kinds of things that the user, the voyager in the psychedelic journey may experience, the side effects that they might go through, the emotional ranges that they experience because they go to very high highs and also potentially very low lows. The psychedelics really unlock a lot of emotions, which is potentially part of the effect and the efficacy. And so the idea is for the psychotherapist to both lead the person through the experience and really critically, once the experience is over, so once the person is out of the acute psychedelic phase, many days, if not weeks, are spent with the psychiatrist and the psychotherapist understanding what the experiences were about and contextualizing those experiences and trying to put the pieces of the jigsaw together as to how that feeling might have related to this fear, which might have blocked this set of motivations and those kinds of things. So it's a very long process. It's not just for the duration of the trip itself. It's actually a multi-week, in some cases month-long, unwinding of the experience. So broadly speaking, it's just good to have a dialogue with a psychiatrist. I mean, the psychiatrists are trained experts. They've seen many different presentations of depression. They're familiar with all the drugs, so they can lead you through pathways, starting from the first line of treatment, the second line of treatment. If that doesn't work, they can assess your symptoms and then redirect you to that pathway versus this pathway, based on their history, their experiences, what they know works in certain cases versus might not work. And so a really well-trained, well-versed psychiatrist who has had some experience with these novel treatments is very valuable. And so at the Black Dog, we have clinicians who have that kind of experience as well. So we have psychiatrists who've done research on brain stimulation, done research on ketamine, done research within psychedelics, and so have developed that sense of where a patient might be best suited. So not every treatment is suited for every depression. Some people, it might actually be in their best interest to stay away from treatments like ketamine and psychedelics because it may in fact exacerbate some of their symptoms and lead to worse outcomes. It's not a one-size-fits-all. And so I think a key thing to convey is this idea that it's really critical to find the treatment that matches the individual. So not everything will work for everyone. Every depression is different. The cause of everyone's depression may be subtly different. And so in some cases, psychotherapy is not the way to go because you need a more biological intervention. In some cases, the biological intervention may not be necessary because the fundamental problem might be to do with a psychotherapy-based problem. So I think that there has been some, I'm fortunate that as a researcher, as a scientist, most of my interaction with my research is with other scientists, and I do get, skepticism, as is the way science goes. You do get skepticism, which is actually how we improve all of our work. So that's absolutely part and parcel of being a scientist. I do know, for example, that I gave a talk to the Sydney Skeptics Society about transcranial magnetic stimulation, which uses magnetic fields. And at the start of the talk, the prevailing opinion from the people attending, the hundreds or so people attending the talk, was that, I was shaking magnets around a person's head, and, how in the world could this do anything in any context, let alone for something as profound as depression. But there is a mountain of research that we can draw on, and then we can build upon, and we can point out exactly how this works and why we think it works. And so I found that once you explain the data, once you explain the facts to people clue in, and they get a sense of what's going on. Same thing with ECT. As you said, electroconvulsive therapy has unfortunately had a massive stigma placed on it from One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. That's usually the main source of media that people point to when they say they have a certain image of ECT in their minds. And it's not been helped in recent movies as well. Unfortunately, I think they've just perpetuated the same image of ECT, which is far from the reality of how ECT is given. But again, if you walk people through what is actually done, if you walk them through the evidence that's accumulated over at the moment, I think 80 years of ECT research, people understand. And so generally, there might be an initial gut feeling of skepticism, a sort of intuition that this cannot possibly work, that this is a bit of snake oil and voodoo and what have you. But generally, I find that once you tell people what is actually happening, they seem quite receptive and then quite hopeful that there are these effective treatments that go beyond drugs that allow psychiatrists a few additional options to try. That there's a type of depression that we call treatment-resistant depression, which means people have failed multiple medications and they've not found something that works for them. And about a third of people that experience depression get labeled with this category of treatment-resistant depression. And you can imagine that these people feel obviously quite poorly because of their depression to start with. But on top of that, you have the compounding effect of feeling a lack of hope, because nothing in their minds will actually bring them out of their depression. And so for those for those people who suffer treatment-resistant depression, it's so valuable to be able to say, well, hang on, you've tried a few medications, and unfortunately they haven't done the job. But we also have this option here, we have this option there, we have that option here, we have this novel treatment there, we've got ketamine, we've got psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, we've got transcranial magnetic stimulation. We have other things that we can look at. So we're not anywhere near the end of the road. We can still take this a bit further and find something that fits you and, takes you out of your specific set of depressive symptoms. So on the Black Dog Institute website, we do have an information page that outlines the treatments that we give both in the clinic, and as well highlights the research that we do in the more novel types of treatments that aren't yet quite ready for full clinical use. So psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy is very new. There are some clinics that give it, but from our perspective, we're still in the research phase, attempting to build up the evidence base and really make sure that we understand what's going on and understand how we can translate that into a clinical setting. And so between those two sources, between the clinical information that we provide and then the research pages that we have, you can read up on the evidence on the website, and that'll give you what you need to know. And if there's any other questions that you might have, I'm sure you can flick an email to the researchers that are involved. Usually we're quite happy to answer and sort of give people a bit of extra information. And so if this research interests you and you'd like to hear a bit more, please have a look at our website and feel free to send us an email and to get in touch and let us know, how you can do more.